Hello guys and welcome back. If you are new around here, I cover mostly Australian cases and today we are covering another solved case. And this case really is a prime example of the justice system failing to do its job and not coming down hard enough on perpetrators. And unfortunately, as a result, a young woman lost her life. And then there's the way that today's victim was portrayed in the media. It was inaccurate and insensitive. As always, my sources are linked down below. And a friendly reminder, I discuss cases on this channel based on available news sources, coverage, books, documentaries, etc. I am not a journalist, just somebody with an interest in researching and reading up on local cases, and I attempt to cover each case on this channel with as much respect for the victim or victims as possible and with as little bias as possible. My videos are not opinion pieces, nor are they presenting new information in any of the cases unless stated. Having said that, let's get into it. So we're heading back to the year of 2009 to New Haven Beach, which is located on a place called Phillip Island. And Phillip Island is, well, an island, about a 2-ish hour drive from Melbourne that sits just off the southern coast of Australia. And I'm not going to lie, I wasn't familiar with Phillip Island before doing research for this video, but it seems somewhat similar to a place called Rottnest Island here in Western Australia. It's the island famous for those incredibly cute, happy little animals called quokkas. I feel like maybe not too many people outside of Western Australia, or at least Australia, would know Rottnest. But if you do, let me know down below. I would be interested to know. Anyway, getting off track, Phillip Island seems most well known for its beaches, the penguins and koalas, and just being a fun family day trip or a camping destination. So what happened on Sunday, August 16 was a stark and gruesome contrast to the island's usual activities. A person walking their dog along New Haven Beach made a horrifying discovery. They found a human leg washed up on the shore. Police came to collect the remains and soon got to work in checking local missing persons cases. Because of the condition of the remains, the injury was deemed as non-survivable and foul play was thought to be involved in the victim's passing. The day following this grisly discovery, passengers on a ferry actually spotted another leg floating in the ocean, but unfortunately, police were never able to locate it. The investigation wasn't having any luck with any missing persons reports, but they did have one thing going for them that would turn out to be a massive help in identifying the victim. The leg had a distinctive tattoo. The tattoo design was red and purple flowers on a vine, so police released a drawing of the tattoo, and this image actually caught the attention of a woman named Sandra Betts. Sandra, whose daughter Raechel had been missing for a few days, had a tattoo that she thought matched the image that was being shared in the media. After DNA testing was conducted on the remains, it was confirmed to be a positive match to Raechel Betts. So let's talk about Raechel Betts. Raechel was a 27-year-old childcare worker that lived in the suburb of Epping in Melbourne. In late 2008, Raechel became aware of 2 teenage girls that were having issues at home. So since she was single and didn't have any children of her own, she let them know that they were more than welcome to stay with her, and they took her up on that offer. Raechel loved children and had an incredibly caring and nurturing nature, which is of course why she worked in childcare, but she was unable to have any children of her own. And I'm guessing Raechel viewed looking after these girls as an opportunity to nurture and guide two young and incredibly impressionable teenagers who were going through some troubles, and over the next several months, the three of them became incredibly close. Of course, going from having no children to having two teenagers to support and look after was no walk in the park. It was not only stressful for Raechel, it was becoming quite a financial burden. And the situation slowly but surely began to overwhelm Raechel. Of course, this was not the fault of the two girls, and I'm sure Raechel would have done anything to look after their well-being. And in fact, as you'll see, she did just that. Raechel ended up taking on a second job to alleviate the financial stress, but unfortunately she did end up losing one of these jobs. And as the pressure began to get to Raechel, she started to isolate herself more and more from her friends and family, and started hanging out with this new crowd of people that, shall we say, were not the best bunch of people and didn't have the best intentions for Raechel. During this time period, when Raechel was at a desperate point in her life, one of these new friends made her an offer that she couldn't refuse. This new friend told Raechel if she sold drugs for him, she would not only make plenty of money, but should only be working a few hours a day. This meant that she would have more than enough money to look after the two girls and have more time to spend with them as well. It seemed too good to be true. I mean, yeah, this situation wasn't ideal, and it certainly wasn't legal. But desperate times call for desperate measures. And after all, this was only going to be temporary until she got back on her feet. Or at least I imagine that's how she viewed this situation. So Raechel agreed. Unfortunately, at some point during this period, Raechel decided that she was going to try the drugs she was dealing for herself, in particular meth. And it wasn't long before she developed an addiction. And I can't speak much about addiction as this is not something that I have any personal experience with. But what I do know is that 1, addiction isn't a choice, and 2, an addiction like meth can completely, totally, and utterly destroy your life. It can and will ruin your mental health, your appearance, your finances, your relationships, your career. And sadly, this was the path that Raechel started to go down. The drugs had a terrible effect on her mental health, leading her to become paranoid and delusional. She began to think that somebody was spying on her and that there were cameras in her house, and that someone or something was out to get her. I also do want to make a point before continuing that any derogatory comments towards Raechel or anyone that suffers with addiction in general will not be tolerated in the comments, and you will be blocked immediately. Raechel, like many that fall into addiction, was in a vulnerable and desperate point in her life. Until we've been to that place ourselves, we can't judge. However, Raechel did eventually get some help and went to rehab. Following the rehab, she temporarily stayed with her mother, Sandra, and I'm a little unsure of the timeline and what was happening during this period, or where the two teenage girls were staying during this time. From what I could gather, they went back home for a bit, and then when Raechel returned to her house, they came back to live with her. Although I believe she was trying to find them a more safe and stable place to live at this point. It wasn't long after this that Raechel disappeared. The last time anyone spoke to her was on the night of August 10, 6 days before her remains were found. She spoke to a friend on the phone, telling them that she had gone fishing. From what this friend could tell, Raechel did not sound scared or appear to be in any imminent danger. When several days passed and Raechel's mother, Sandra, was unable to get a hold of her, she started phoning friends and family, but nobody had heard a thing from Raechel. The 2 teenage girls in Raechel's care were also asked about her whereabouts, given that the 3 of them were so close, but when asked, they both came across a little bit scared and cagey. One of them said that they had recently spoke to Raechel and that she was fine. But as it would turn out, the 2 girls knew a little bit more than they were letting on. The investigation began, as you would imagine, by having a look into the illegal drug activity in Raechel's life and those that she associated with because of it. Her mother, Sandra Betts, had one person in particular in mind that she thought might have had some involvement in her daughter's disappearance. A 55-year-old man named John Leslie Coombs. John Coombs supplied the drugs that Raechel sold, so for all intents and purposes, he was her boss. And remember when I mentioned a moment ago that Raechel had told a friend that she had gone fishing right before she disappeared? Well, apparently gone fishing is slang in that world at least for taking care of drug dealings, drug business, etc. Who knew? Not me. When I tell you I literally know nothing about drugs, I'm not saying that because I have a public platform. I have literally always been totally clueless and it's just never really been my scene. But I mean, you do you, no judgment. When I was like 15 or 16, this girl offered me a stick and I thought she was offering me a piece of gum. She wasn't, and I was incredibly disappointed. But anyway, getting distracted. So Raechel had also told the 2 teenage girls that she was going on a fishing trip with her boss, John Coombs, but said to them that she would be back within 2 days. I should also mention that these girls were aware of Raechel's involvement with drugs. As I said before, the girls had been a little scared to discuss what they knew about where Raechel had gone, and I'm guessing that's because they knew that Coombs wasn't exactly a good guy. Plus, of course, the fact that they were talking to police about drug activity, and maybe they didn't want to get Raechel in trouble or rat her out, or get themselves in trouble for that matter. But they did eventually open up. The girls also let the investigation know that on August 10, Raechel had driven to the suburb of Heidelberg Heights, parked her car, and then met John Coombs at a nearby shop. So as it turned out, besides being a drug boss, John Coombs had a pretty extensive criminal history, and in fact was on parole at the time of Raechel's disappearance for murder. He had been paroled just 2 years previous in 2007 after spending 10 years in jail. Before that, he had also been in jail for murder. So what exactly was a 2-time killer doing out on the streets, selling drugs no less, considering he was on parole and should have been behaving? As you can imagine, the investigation promptly got in contact with John Coombs, who did have an alibi for the time of Raechel's disappearance, an alibi backed up by his friend or lover, I'm still not too sure. But her name was Nicole Godfrey and she was 28 years old. But phone records would soon show that this alibi was a total and utter lie. Following this, police arrested and charged John Coombs for the murder of Raechel Betts, and his friend slash maybe lover, Nicole Godfrey, was also arrested. So let's quickly go over the crimes of John Leslie Coombs, beginning all the way back in the 1980s. In February of 1984, in the Mornington Peninsula, a place very close to Melbourne, a 20-year-old man named Michael Sperani was selling his car, and John Coombs was interested in buying it. Coombs went to check out the car, explaining to Michael that he needed a vehicle that was capable of towing his boat. This conversation somehow led Coombs to inviting Michael on a boating or fishing trip of sorts. A trip that Michael would never return from. As it turned out, Michael was dating a friend of Coombs, and Coombs apparently didn't approve of this relationship, so he decided to simply eliminate Michael. On Sunday, February 26, Coombs stabbed Michael Sperani to death on the boat before mutilating his body with the boat's propeller. Michael's murder would remain unsolved for 12 years. And you will probably see a pattern developing of Coombs murdering people for basically little to no reason and murdering them in a very gruesome fashion. Later that same year, on Saturday, November 17, in the suburb of Chelsea, Melbourne, Coombs entered the home of 44-year-old Henry Raymond Kells, where he proceeded to assault and stab him to death. And the only motivation I could find behind this murder was because a friend of Coombs, Andrew Herald Opie, didn't like that Henry Kells was associating with his landlady. I'm sure there has to be more to the story than this, but this is all I could find, unfortunately. Although Coombs does seem to have a pattern of murdering people for basically no rhyme or reason, so who knows? 10 days after this murder, both John Coombs and Andrew Opie were arrested and charged for the murder of Henry Kells. The following year, Coombs was sentenced to life in prison, which was later reduced to just 11 years after an appeal. 3 years into his sentence, Coombs escaped from prison, along with another inmate, only to be recaptured 2 days later, and this added 6 more months to his sentence. At his 1996 parole hearing, Coombs was labelled as not a substantial threat and released. Of course, at the time, nobody knew that he had murdered 2 people, not 1. But just 3 months after his release, John Coombs was arrested again for the 1984 unsolved murder of Michael Sperani. For this crime, he was sentenced to 15 years with a non-parole period of 10. And don't ask me how or why he got such an incredibly light sentence for his second murder, but honestly, that's that on the pathetic Australian justice system. And by February of 2007, John Coombs was once again out on parole, labelled as rehabilitated. Seriously, this case is unbelievable to me and infuriating. And it would be just over 2 years later that John Coombs would kill again. I would say very predictably, of course. As we know, this time he killed Raechel Betts. For reasons we may never know, but I am going to discuss that in just a moment. So let's discuss exactly what happened the day Raechel was killed. Or should I say, what John Coombs says happened. Although, given his history, it is hard to believe a word that comes out of his mouth. On Wednesday, August 12, 2009, Raechel was picked up by Coombs in Heidelberg Heights and driven to the home of his friend, lover, who knows, Nicole Godfrey, who lived on Phillip Island. After arriving, Coombs claimed that Raechel told him some information that made him, in his words, snap. He alleges that she admitted to him that she had sexually exploited the two teenage girls in her care to make money, which, by the way, literally makes no sense. Raechel was doing everything she could financially to support these girls, so why would she want to harm them? If they were such a bother to her, she could have just sent them home. Coombs, who was a victim of sexual abuse himself as a child, he says, also told investigators that Raechel had offered him the youngest girl for sex. None of these claims, by the way, have ever been proven, and both girls deny that they were ever sexually abused. Coombs said he snapped after hearing Raechel's admission, strangled her to death, and mutilated her body before dismembering her. So it's pretty clear to me, and to many others, that Coombs was just attempting to appear like the good guy in this situation by giving a noble reason for the killing. Some of the other more legitimate theories, though, for the murder are that it was a drug deal gone wrong, which, let's face it, makes way more sense. Or the possibility that Coombs asked Raechel to sleep with him and she refused. Maybe there was an altercation, so he killed her out of anger. The owner of the house Raechel was killed in, Nicole Godfrey, was actually home when all of this was happening, although she didn't participate in the murder directly. John Coombs then took Raechel's lifeless body into the bathroom, where he placed it in the bathtub and proceeded to dismember her body, a process which apparently continued on and off for the next 24 hours. At one point, he even asked Nicole if she would like to see a dissection, which she declined. As Coombs retold his version of events to investigators, he told them that Raechel got what she deserved, and he described her body as simply a piece of meat that needed discarding. His words were incredibly cold and callous, and it was pretty clear to investigators that he had no remorse for what he had done. At one point, he even described murder as better than sex, so there's that. When investigators spoke with Nicole, she told them that she could hear the popping of bones as she lay in the bedroom. She says that when the dismemberment began, she had to turn the TV on and cover her ears to drown out what was happening. After Coombs was finished, he placed Raechel's remains in plastic bags, took them down to New Haven Pier, and carelessly threw them in the ocean. 4 days later, on August 16, her leg would wash up on shore. It's also worth noting that when the bathroom where the dismemberment took place was tested for Raechel's DNA, none was discovered, although bleach had been used to clean the area. In the end, we will never truly know what happened to Raechel on the day she lost her life, or the real reasons behind it. On August 26, 2011, John Leslie Coombs was sentenced to, finally, life in prison for the murder of Raechel Betts with no possibility of parole. After the sentencing, as Coombs was being led out, he gave the middle finger to the courtroom, truly signifying how little remorse he had for what he had done. Nicole Godfrey pled guilty to perverting the course of justice for the false alibi and was sentenced to a 3-year jail term, suspended for 3 years. I would say third time's a charm, but clearly Coombs never ever should have been paroled in the first place, especially after being arrested and sentenced for a second murder. It doesn't make any sense to me that a 2-time killer would not get life in the first place. Why were their lives not worth more? Raechel Betts should still be alive today. But this complete, total and utter failure of the Australian justice system meant she would eventually cross paths with a monster. By definition, Coombs is a serial killer. And it's almost certain that if he were released again, he would kill again. And then we have the way the media portrayed Raechel. I'll be honest, before I dove into researching this case, what I knew about it were the bare bone facts. A drug dealer was murdered by her drug supplier, and some sort of whisperings about young girls being sexually exploited. That was the extent of what I knew. And honestly, if you were to spend only 5 minutes Googling this case, I don't believe that you would get an accurate or clear depiction of who Raechel was as a person or anything about her life and how she came to find herself in the situation that she ended up in. If you were to dig a little deeper, you'd see that Raechel was a caring and good person that made one bad life decision that led her down a rocky path. And unfortunately, she met the wrong person at the end of it. I believe it is so important to discuss cases like this where the victim is not always portrayed accurately or in the best light. Similar to my Morgan Huxley video from a few weeks ago. I'm sure that you will all agree that this was an incredibly frustrating case to hear, but let me know your thoughts below. Anyway, that is all from me today. Thank you for being here and listening to Raechel's story. And until next time, stay vigilant and stay safe.